There are albums that define a band, and then there are albums that define an entire genre of music.
The killer metal album.
Released 50 years ago today, said Wings of Destiny incorporated everything early heavy metal stood for. So today, let's take a look at how one of the most important heavy metal albums of all time was created, discuss the financial problems, label pressure, and the rejected songs from it, and then talk about how Judas Priest's stubborn refusal to give up would help them eventually save the genre on their quest to become one of the greatest heavy metal bands to ever walk this earth. Here you go. Here guys, as always, please do not hesitate to comment on anything you hear or see in this video, and especially if you disagree with me, because the whole point of our Defenders of the Faith series is, of course, to start a conversation. But alright, let's do it. Back in September of 1974, Judas Priest released their debut studio album, Rock'n'Rolla. Yet, instead of launching the band into superstardom, it almost did the exact opposite. The album did show promise, a mix of styles, influences, and ideas, but commercially it barely moved. Only a few thousand copies were sold, and the reviews, especially in the local press during the supporting European tour, well, they were far from what the band actually hoped for. And the craziest thing is that all of that was, I truly believe, not really because of the songwriting, but because of the poor production, which, as pretty much every viewer of our Defenders of the Faith video series knows, the band was very unhappy with. But the craziest thing is that the things didn't just stall. They gradually got worse for Judas Priest. The band found themselves in a serious financial trouble. Their label, Gull Records, a small independent label from the United Kingdom, also suffered from financial troubles and from time to time even simply refused to pay the band. And as the band later on recalled, there were actually some nights when they had no idea when their next meal would be. And in addition to the whole fact that although they did share the stage with such bands as UFO or Pink Fairies, who were a pretty big deal back in that time, their live shows weren't exactly consistent either, jeopardizing the whole existence of Judas Priest, who are still pretty far from becoming the metal gods we know today. And then came yet another blow. Their drummer, John Hinch, left the band. And the biggest problem in that situation was the whole fact that in addition to being their drummer, John was actually also Judas Priest's driver and their tour manager.
Good drummer. Great look, good drummer,
Good drummer.
fine.
And the truth is that Hinch wasn't actually a bad drummer, far from it. Although he did come from a jazz and fusion background and preferred smaller traditional kits, pretty different from the ones used by most rock and metal musicians even at that time, which actually contradicted the whole direction Judas Priest wanted to pursue in mid-70s, as the whole reason why they weren't exactly happy with Rock'n'Rolla was because they wanted to move towards much heavier, louder, and more aggressive sound. And as Rob Halford later on recalled, rehearsals did become increasingly frustrating, with Hinch, although doing his best, still simply not being able to deliver the sound Judas Priest were aiming for. And so, given all that, by 1975, Judas Priest were in a pretty dire situation. At that point in their early career, they simply had one shot at glory, and their next studio album had to be the album that would define them as the fourth in the world of heavy metal. And we all know that it would be such. But first things first. At first, Judas Priest simply had to fix the most immediate problem. They needed a new drummer. And so KK Downing and Glenn Tipton turned to someone who was already familiar with the band, Alan Moore. Yes, the same Moore who had joined Judas Priest back in 1971 and played with them for about a year before he left to join the country rock band Sundance, with whom, by the way, Moore recorded their album Rain, Steam, Speed back in 1974. So, after not that much convincing that had to be done, back in 1975, Moore was back in Judas Priest, and right in about time to start the recording process for said Wings of Destiny, only for the band to find out that their problems were far from being solved. The Gull label provided the band with a budget of just £2,000 for the entire recording, and during those sessions, the band members were still struggling financially, limiting themselves to one meal a day. No, seriously, pretty much all of them remember that back in the day, they only had money for just one meal. And so, in order to survive and continue pursuing their dream, they had to take the day jobs. Thus, Kiki Downing worked in the factory, Glenn Tipton worked as a gardener, and Ian Hill drove a delivery van. And so in the middle of all that, they walked into the Rockfield studios, which, by the way, they also could only afford from the 3 p.m. to 3 a.m. time slots, which nobody else wanted, yet which actually, in a strange twist of fate, helped them quite a lot, as because of all those financial troubles, the band stayed completely sober throughout the recording process, allowing them to fully concentrate on the musical direction they wanted to pursue on what would eventually become said Wings of Destiny.
You're in for a shock.
Yet, instantly enough, upon walking into that studio, Judas Priest already had quite a lot of material ready to be recorded, as some of the songs recorded during the said Wings of Destiny sessions were actually initially intended for rock and roll, and among those were actually some of the best songs Judas Priest have ever written, and especially in their early career, including Tyrant, The Ripper, and Epitaph, which Glenn Tipton wrote 2 years before during the debut album recording, yet the producer Roger Bain rejected them completely back in the day, as he actually thought that those songs were not commercial enough for Judas Priest. Yeah, seriously. And in addition to that, during the rock and roll sessions, Bain also refused one more song. And to be honest with you, I am extremely happy he did that, as that song was of course Whiskey Woman, which was created in the early days of Judas Priest when Al Atkins was still a frontman of the band, and which was actually a fan favorite at the early Judas Priest gigs, and thus for many Judas Priest fans back in 1974, not hearing it on their debut album was a huge surprise. Yet, of course, as we all know, it is that song, which later on was combined with Red Light Lady, written by Rob Halford, which was eventually recorded to what, in my opinion, is actually one of the best heavy metal songs ever written, the legendary Victim of Changes. And by the way, guys, there are actually a bunch of special videos dedicated to both rock and roll recording sessions and to Victim of Changes, so I'm not gonna go into the details of that song's creation in this particular episode. You should just watch those videos afterwards. But for now, I just have to point out that I'm extremely happy that Victim of Changes was not released on Rock and Roll, as although I actually believe that Rock and Roll was a great album, it still didn't sound like what Judas Priest should have sounded back in the day. And given the whole fact that many, including myself, actually consider Victim of Changes to be one of the most genre-definitive songs of the 1970s heavy metal, if it would not have sounded the way it did on said Wings of Destiny, who knows? Maybe Judas Priest would never be able to hit the heights they eventually would, and maybe heavy metal would not have even survived the 1970s, as many predicted back in the day. So yeah, on behalf of all the heavy metal maniacs around the world, thank you, Roger Bain. Here guys, super quick, just want to point out that only around 30% of the people who watch my videos are actually subscribed to this channel, so if you're not one of those, and especially if this is not the first Judas Priest related video you're watching here, I would really appreciate it if you would consider subscribing right now. Let's continue building this amazing heavy metal community together. But instantly enough, one of the first songs recorded together with Alan Moore after his return to Judas Priest was actually the song that did not make it on said Wings of Destiny, yet nevertheless would eventually become one of the Judas Priest fans' favorite in their entire catalog, and that one of course being Diamonds and Rust, which saw the light of day later on Sin After Sin. Originally written and recorded by Joan Baez in 1975, the song reflects on her relationship with another iconic figure of the 1960s, Bob Dylan, or so many people believe. But in reality, that's actually not true, and that song was actually written by Joan Baez about her husband and not Bob Dylan. But nevertheless, talking about Judas Priest, as Rob Halford recalled, around that time, Judas Priest were starting to gain some attention in America, and their label, Gull Records, suggested that the band should consider recording a cover, something that might help them break into the American rock scene. The first time of the many times Judas Priest would attempt to do so in the years to come. But in a nutshell, the band, and especially in their position in 1975, were all for it and had no objections against breaking into the American rock scene. Yet nevertheless, when they heard this song that the Gull Records representatives chose for them, they were rather confused, as the whole idea of said Wings of Destiny was for them to prove to their fans that they are a heavy metal band, and especially to those who were not able to witness their live performances and only knew about them after their debut Rock'n'Rolla, which once again they were really not happy with.
What? What the fuck?
And so fitting a folk ballad on a heavy metal album, and especially in the mid-70s, seemed like a rather strange idea.
Stupid, Jack. The word is stupid.
But since their label, with whom they were in rather tense relationships at that time, really insisted on it, Judas Priest decided to go along with them. Yet, instead of just making a cover, they decided to make it a truly Judas Priest track, transforming and reshaping it into something completely different without losing its essence, yet making it sound unmistakably Judas Priest-like, and eventually forging it into a song which would become one of the most recognized metal hymns of all time. And here's the thing, I'm actually in touch with the Exciter Records, who were responsible for the Rock'n'Rolla remix, and the people who were working on that remix were able to get hold of the original version of Diamonds and Rust, not in the mix which was released on the many Rock'n'Rolla reissues by Gull Records, but the actual master tapes. And according to them, the original recording of Diamonds and Rust was way more metal and way more aggressive than the version we all know, and which would eventually make it later on Sin After Sin album. And so I truly hope that in honor of said Wings of Destiny's 50th anniversary, in addition to Victim of Changes and all the other legendary tracks written by Judas Priest, we will also be able to hear the original reinterpretation of Diamonds and Rust in its most raw and aggressive form, and done in a way it was always meant to be heard. And given the whole fact that today, Judas Priest and Exciter Records have finally let it out in the open and announced the 50th anniversary reissue of said Wings of Destiny, that dream has just become much closer for all of us diehard Judas Priest fans. Yet said Wings of Destiny's music was by far not the only thing that made this album so indicative of the era it was released in, and so groundbreaking and important for Judas Priest themselves. As on this said Wings of Destiny artwork, Judas Priest have stepped into something that would later on define them as a band, and once again capture the whole essence of the early style heavy metal. For the band's second album, the Gull Records brought in artist Patrick Woodruff, who at that time was already pretty well known in prog rock circles and was on the verge of becoming a cover artist for, well, classical music releases. And innocently enough, just a couple of years earlier, in 1974, CBS Records, who would, after the release of said Wings of Destiny, steal Judas Priest from Gull Records, would commission Woodruff to create an artwork for a release of Ludwig van Beethoven's Emperor Concerto, which, for the record, is one of the most metal classical pieces ever. And for that release, Woodruff created an oil painting that, in my opinion, simply captured the whole essence of that grandeur piece, which, sadly enough, CBS decided to not use that time. But later on, that artwork would actually find its way into Woodruff's own projects, including his 1978 calendar and the book The Pentateuch of the Cosmogony, and many years later would even appear and be sold at Sotheby's.
Great, we can just put that into your retirement account and make it go to work for you, and it's gone.
But at the same time, Woodruff wasn't completely a stranger to heavier side of music as well. In 1975, he had already created the artwork for Budgie's Bandolier, one of the key releases in early heavy metal history by a band, which would actually take Judas Priest on the road with them quite often those days. And so when Gull Records commissioned Woodruff to create a cover artwork for Judas Priest's second studio album, he already had a couple of ideas in mind, eventually creating a piece titled Fallen Angel, a striking image of a grounded angel, wounded, struggling, yet still powerful, with a symbol around his neck, which would later on become one of the most recognizable symbols in the world of heavy metal, the legendary Judas Priest three-pronged cross. Those who have watched my Said Wings of Destiny artwork episode already do know it, but in my opinion this is just too good of a story to not mention it in this one, even if briefly. Initially, Woodruff had absolutely no plans to add this cross to the picture, but according to Rob Halford, although the band abso-freaking-lutely loved the artwork, there was still something missing in the centerpiece of it. And that's when Rob came up with an idea of putting something around Angel's neck. Something similar to a crucifixion, but not quite it. And so Woodruff would simply quickly come up with something he had most likely originally seen in one of the old magazines on ancient Egypt and put it around the angel's neck. And that something would eventually become the symbol of Judas Priest. And here we come to the most important point regarding the Said Wings of Destiny artwork, as it was the artwork completely different from anything Judas Priest released before or after it. Yet at the same time, it did become not only one of the most recognizable artworks in the world of heavy metal, but also the most definitive for Judas Priest's future career. As in addition to the whole fact that with its gothic darkness, it perfectly captured the whole essence of the early style heavy metal, before Judas Priest themselves would electrify it and bring the punk rock aggression into heavy metal several years afterwards. It would also shape the whole identity of Judas Priest. Yes, including introducing the cross itself, which, by the way, for the record, was not used by Judas Priest all the way until 1984, yet was widely used by Judas Priest fans around the globe, but also by simply introducing one of the most important characters in the Judas Priest lore, as it is the angel from the Said Wings of Destiny album artwork, who would later on appear on Painkiller, Angel of Retribution, Redeemer of Souls, and even Invincible Shield, defining the band's identity for years to come. Oh, and by the way guys, ahead of the Judas Priest Faith Keepers tour, I just have to remind you that if you would like to rock the Defender of the Faith merch, the upcoming shows, and support our incredible heavy metal community, you can order it via the link in the description to this video, and I'll be more than happy to send it pretty much anywhere across the world. And yeah, thank you guys so much for all your support and help, because it does help me out quite a lot amidst all the craziness that is going on here in Ukraine. And thus we come to the most important question of this video. What exactly made Said Wings of Destiny so important, both for Judas Priest and for heavy metal? As if we're being very honest, it is a rather strange release for Judas Priest. And more specifically, it actually weirdly became the last ever Judas Priest release on which they did not exactly try to push the boundaries of their own sound. As from Sin After Sin onwards, they did become the avant-garde force of heavy metal, completely changing and reshaping the genre with every album they ever released, and especially in the late 70s and early 80s. Yet on Said Wings of Destiny, their aim was actually completely different, as the whole purpose of Said Wings of Destiny was to shape Judas Priest as we know it today. On Rockroller, the band still sounded like a mix of hard rock, blues, and progressive influences, and it was on Said Wings of Destiny that their sound was sharpened, focused, and transformed into something much heavier, darker, and far more precise. Something that actually embodied the whole mood, feel, and atmosphere of the heavy rock underground British scene. But most importantly, in addition to becoming the genre definitive and quintessential album for the 70s style heavy metal, it also became a pivotal one for the genre, as it was the album with which Judas Priest came out and for the very first time ever proudly declared themselves as a heavy metal band. Because yeah, the truth is that many consider Black Sabbath by Black Sabbath the first heavy metal album, and it is so stylistically. But at the same time, Black Sabbath themselves did not really consider themselves heavy metal, and especially in the early 70s. And so it was Judas Priest, and it was Said Wings of Destiny, on which this band has come out into the world of music and proudly declared that heavy metal is a standalone genre. And no matter what anyone may say, it is here to stay. So happy 50th, the legendary Said Wings of Destiny. But anyways, what did you personally think about said Wings of Destiny, and which is your favorite song from this album? Please let us know in the comments in honor of the 50th anniversary of this legendary record, which I truly hope will get some love, including some deep cuts on the upcoming Faith Keepers tour this year. But for now, thank you so much for watching this video, guys, and we will prevail. Slava Ukraini!